Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Oksana Klimenko. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. And I'm glad to introduce our today's speaker, Dr. Martin-Oleksandr Kisly. He was born in Simferopol, Crimea. He's a historian specializing in the history of Crimea and the Crimean Tatars, with a particular focus on the Soviet and post-Soviet periods. In 2021, he defended his PhD dissertation, which calls the return of the Crimean Tatars to their homeland, 1956-1989. His research interests include oral history, memory, trauma, identity, migration, and colonialism. He serves as an expert on the Council for Cognitive Deoccupation under the mission of the President of Ukraine in the Autonomous Republic of Crimea, and the executive director of the Association for Central, South, Eastern, and Eastern European, Central, and Northern Asian Studies in Global Conversation. Also, he works as a Kyiv Mahila Academy and Crimean Studies Center. The topic of his speech is From Dispossession to Return, Soviet Colonialism and Crimean Tatars Homecoming. Also, I would like to admit before we start that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Sinabeg, Ininabuk, Inisinabuk, Dakota, Oyate, and Deneslin, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So I think we can start, and if you have some questions, you will be able to ask after presentation, please.
Yeah, thank you, Oksana. Thank you for making today's event possible, and it's a pleasure for me to deliver the lecture on a topic which is closely connected to my research. The deportation of the Crimean Tatars, which began on May 18, 1944, and lasted 3 days, was not merely an event, but a prolonged process that unfolded over time. In deportation, this is how Crimean Tatars refer to the years of exile. The deportation of an entire people not only claimed the lives of tens of thousands, but also stripped the Crimean Tatar nation of its homeland, its name, and its political subjectivity for decades. In many ways, deportation can be understood as a structure, one composed of Soviet genocidal policies, settler colonialism, and at the same time, the persistent efforts of the Crimean Tatar people to preserve their identity and reclaim their homeland from exile. To grasp the full meaning of the 1944 deportation, we must begin with its deeper roots. And that story starts in 1783, when the Russian Empire annexed the Crimean Khanate, marking the beginning of Russia's presence on the peninsula. The process of incorporating Crimea into empire was slow, and it continued through the 19th century, a time that was the era of colonization for Western European empires. Beyond the idea of creating a paradise for the Russian Empire, there was another argument for the occupation of Crimea. Most major European powers had acquired colonies, but it's time and Russia too was in a need to follow the example. Because of its mostly Muslim population, Crimea allowed the Russian Empire to feel more European, but by getting an oriental colony of its own. In this way, Crimea was gradually transformed into a settler colony. Settler colonization is a form of foreign invasion in which colonizers seek to take control of the land and replace the local indigenous population with settlers. Unlike other types of colonization, settler colonizers are not interested in a long-term economic cooperation with the local people. And as soon as they have enough power, their policies lead to the elimination or displacement of indigenous populations through various economic, political, and cultural practices. Narratives about invasion play a key role in the process of settler colonization. Western settler colonial empires developed a range of these about colonized people to justify the aggression. Victims of colonization were often portrayed as wild, uncivilized, poorly organized, and even aggressive societies that needed guidance from more advanced powers. Settler colonial narratives frequently described colonizers as benevolent givers, people who came not to oppress but to help, to share their culture, and even to bring modernity. A striking example of this logic can be found in Catherine's manifesto on the annexation of Crimea, where it was claimed that the Crimean Tatars were incapable of tasting the fruits of freedom, and therefore they needed the protection of a more civilized power, one that would save them from disorder. Peter Powers, a Prussian naturalist invited to the Russian Empire by Catherine, he wrote in his travel notes that the Crimean Tatars were useless, inactive, and even dangerous. The process of incorporation of Crimea involved the introduction of different land ownership laws. As a result, many Crimean Tatars were deprived of their land and were forced to leave Crimea due to poverty. Moreover, although the manifesto promised that all customs and traditions of the Crimean Tatars would be protected by Russian authorities, after the annexation they faced religious persecution. Many Crimean Tatars who were Muslims by faith left on the peninsula for the Ottoman Empire for religious reasons. This and other reasons led to the constant, semi-forced migration of the Crimean Tatars through the 19th century, a process often referred to as the Great Exodus. Meanwhile, the empire was bringing more and more settlers to the peninsula, both from within its own borders and from other European countries. By the early 20th century, the Crimean Tatars had become a minority in their own indigenous land. In Crimean Tatars literature and cultural memory, the 19th century is remembered as Kara Asir, which means Black Century. In the 19th century, it was not only the ethnic composition of Crimea that changed. The very perception and accounting of the peninsula were reshaped in the course of its colonization. Alongside the settlement of Crimea by newcomers, one must also note its transformation into a popular destination for leisure and retreat due to constant migration of Crimean Tatars and the construction of the railroad after the Crimean War. Crimea became the Russian Riviera. It allowed Russian tourists to see themselves as representatives of the imperial capital on the Asian Muslim periphery, reinforcing their sense of belonging to a superior Christian European civilization. It is worth noting that in earlier times, Russian aristocrats had traveled to Nice, where they didn't always feel this sense of primacy and superiority. Instead, by the late 19th century, vacation in Crimea, rather than abroad, had also become a marker of patriotism among Russians. Crimea became a truly popular resort thanks to its air, climate, and the sea, of course. It was widely believed that the local environment could cure a range of illnesses, including tuberculosis, syphilis, and digestive disorders. The Crimean Tatars were perceived as an exotic element of the southern retreat. For instance, Crimean Tatar guides became an integral part of tourists' vacation experience, often serving as subjects of colonial era sexual objectification. In this context, an eroticized image of the Crimean Tatar horseman emerged, reinforcing Orientalist fantasies within this imperial imagination. At the turn of the century, Crimean Tatars began to awaken from the Black Century. The late 19th and the early 20th centuries were a time of rising nationalisms across the world and the region, and the Crimean Tatars were no exception. They had every reason to join this wave because of a living memory of their lost statehood and the golden cradle of their people, the Crimean Khanate, an empire that had occupied their homeland, the absence of political institutions, and of course, a clearly geographically defined homeland. In 1909, in Istanbul, Crimean Tatar students founded the organization called Vatan, which means fatherland. Among them were Zafer Sidamet and Namanchli Bijihan, you can see them on the photo. And their declared goal was to liberate Crimea, to liberate the Crimean Tatar people from colonial rule. The emergence of this new Crimean Tatar elite, inspired by the ideas of nation building and anti-colonial struggle, led to the creation of the National Party called Milli Firqa in 1917. By the time of the overthrow of the monarchy in the Russian Empire, which created an opportunity for the self-determination of many peoples, and the Crimean Tatars immediately seized it. On December 9, 1917, the RUTA, which was the National Crimean Tatar Assembly, began its work. And during the preparations for the RUTA, women had the right both to elect delegates and to be elected as delegates. For women, we were elected to the assembly, and Shafika Gasprinska, she was chosen as a member of the presidium. Thus, for the first time in the Muslim world and earlier than in most Western countries, women suffrage was introduced in Crimea. The result of the RUTA's work was a constitution that was democratic and liberal, because this document was remarkably progressive for its time, not only within the Turkic and Muslim world, but more broadly. The Bolsheviks reacted negatively to the RUTA and adoption of the constitution, as well as proclaimed intention of Crimean Tatars to create the independent state. Crimean Tatars tried to resist the Bolsheviks, but later outnumbered Crimean armed forces. In January 1918, after battles with Crimean Tatar units, Bolsheviks captured Simferopol. The RUTA ceased to exist, and the head of Crimean government, Namanchli Bijihan, was imprisoned and later executed. The establishment of Soviet power in Crimea was marked by Red Terror and famine, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. Soon after, the Soviets created the Crimean Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, positioning Crimean Tatars as the native people of this new autonomy. The Bolsheviks launched a policy of indigenization, promoting national minorities through cultural development, language support, and political inclusion. The Soviet indigenization policy in Crimea had several goals: to spread the communist revolution to the Turkic and Muslim world, to transform the Crimean Tatars into loyal Soviet citizens, and to co-opt and control the Crimean Tatar elite while presenting the Soviet regime as a liberator from imperial oppression. To put it simple, through emancipation, modernization, and of course state-controlled nation building, the Bolsheviks sought to transform the Crimean Tatar population into Soviet citizens. However, this period of relative support and Soviet civilizing mission was short-lived. Indigenization was soon abandoned and repression returned, and the new generation of Crimean Tatars, leaders, artists, intellectuals, it was destroyed. Thousands of them were killed during the Stalin's Great Purge. But the persecution of Crimean Tatars continued beyond this. The Crimean Tatars deportation started early in the morning on 18th of May 1944. According to the decision of the State Committee signed by Stalin, the expulsion had to be completed by 1st of June. However, the heads of the operation decided to fulfill and over-fulfill the plan, and the entire population was deported in 3 days. Soldiers woke up children and adults, rarely explaining what was happening. The Crimean Tatars were not told where they were going, and therefore even those who had the opportunity to take some valuables with them, they were confused what exactly they needed to take. They were given 15 minutes for preparation, and in some places people were simply pushed out of their houses by force and were not even allowed to take the most valuable things. We were given 15 minutes to pack. They didn't allow us to take money, neither German nor Soviet. Gold or jewelry was not allowed to be taken too. The most valuable thing is the currents. Many women cried, they kissed the currents, and the soldiers didn't understand what it is. Pulled out, thrown, some scarred, some beaten. It was different in different places. In the village of Uskut, one old man refused to leave the house. He was shot dead. Crimean Tatars were taken to railway stations where they were loaded into freight cars, which were not suitable for transporting people, without sanitary conditions, food, or medical care in overcrowded cars. The entire population went on a several-week journey into exile, but not everyone was destined to get to their destination, as approximately 8,000 died on the road due to inhuman conditions in the cars. It was tight, we all sat, there was no opportunity to lie down. We traveled for a long time, 20 days, maybe longer. No care on the road. Feeding, I don't remember that they gave us something, but if they did, I forgot. There was no toilet. There were 2 other girls of my age in the car. They were sitting near the entrance. They probably didn't arrive, I don't remember. I remember them were sick in the first days, and then I don't remember. Probably they died on the way. The deportation was carried out by the Soviet regime using an extensive array of repressive institutions and resources involving around 23,000 of NKVD soldiers and officers, 2,000 cargo trucks, and 67 trade convoys. Ultimately, the scale and speed allowed the local authorities to report to Moscow by May 20 that Crimea had been cleansed of Crimean Tatars. Even though the final destination, according to the decree, was the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, trains with deportees were sent also to the special settlements in Ural and other areas of the Soviet Union. The total numbers of Crimean Tatars deprived of their homeland was approximately 200,000. On the road and during years in special settlements, almost 50,000 people died due to high mortality caused by deportation and conditions in exile. Upon arrival at their places of exile, the deportees faced harsh forced labor, hunger, unsanitary conditions, the spread of epidemics, and complete social isolation. The Crimean Tatar people were placed in specially created isolated settlements, so-called special settlements, which in effect became Soviet reservations. A strict regime of control was enforced there. Mandatory registration at special commandant office, strict prohibition on leaving the settlement boundaries, and constant control by repressive authorities. The status of special settlers meant lifelong discrimination and restrictions on basic rights like freedom of movement, access to education, medical care, and employment according to one's profession. In particular, there was a ban on leaving the settlement area without the permission of the commandant, with the penalty being 20 years of hard labor in some kind of penal camp. People were not even allowed to visit a neighboring village where their relatives had been sent, not even to attend the funeral of a loved one. Displaced persons also had to visit the commandant's office regularly to check in. However, some Crimean Tatars did attempt to escape. By 1947, a recorded total of 25,000 deportees had fled from their assigned places of settlement, with the Soviet authorities managing to recapture only 10,000. The persecution by the commandant's office was horrific. They abused us, however they pleased. They confiscated my mother's documents and destroyed them, leaving her without a work record book. Whenever she turned for help, the answer was always the same. Special settlers were not allowed to have documents. We were treated like livestock. They beat us when they wanted, killed when they wanted, without any consequences. Every month we were required to report to the commandant's office. People were not allowed to visit even a neighboring cowhouse or take a sick person to another town for treatment without permission. In 1947, my mother dared to escape, despite the risk of 20 years of hard labor for fleeing, and we moved to Uzbekistan, to the Bulgur district of Samarkand region. The first years of exile, as I said previously, were marked by high death tolls caused by starvation, diseases, and acts of oppression committed by the authorities. The lack of a proper housing, food shortages, new climatic conditions, absence of a basic healthcare facilities, and the consequent rapid spread of diseases resulted in severe demographic losses. Almost every family witnessed death as a consequence of starvation or infectious diseases. I washed the bodies of children and women. The mullah washed the men. We buried them, but in the morning we would see that the hungry wolves had dug up and torn apart the corpse. A year later, my 12-year-old daughter Medine died, and soon after my little son Yusuf. Before her death, Medine confessed that more than anything in the world she wished she could eat just a piece of watermelon. Later, we moved to Uzbekistan at the invitation of my brother-in-law. There were plenty of watermelon there, but I couldn't look at them without tears, and I never ate them myself. The Crimean Tatars were exploited as source of a menial labor. Those sent to the special settlements were involved in industry, coal, uranium mining, chemical production, construction of new hydroelectric stations, and of course served as workers in various factories. Initially, however, the Soviet government sought to use the Crimean Tatar special settlers as a means of staffing state-run farms, with more than 100,000 being involved in agriculture. Children too were obliged to work, especially in the cotton fields of Uzbekistan. My mother worked within the cotton fields. The brigade leader gave her the largest hoe, so heavy she doesn't even lift it. I witnessed how one day the brigade leader, riding a horse, whipped a boy of about 10 or 12 years old to death, he was never punished, as if he had killed an insect, not a human being. Living conditions in exile began to improve slightly for the Crimean Tatars in 1948. That year, men who had served in the Red Army during the war and who, upon demobilization in 1945, were sent to labor camps, they were finally allowed to search for their families. Those fortunate enough to find their relatives still alive did everything they could to save them from poverty or hunger. Unfortunately, due to the lack of access to classified documents in the archive of the Russian Federation, we don't have enough knowledge to answer the question of what caused the deportation. There is one version, let's call it the official version of the Soviet authorities, and I suspect some of you may have even heard about it, but I don't wish to repeat it here, not even for the sake of debunking a historical myth. Rather than reinforcing this narrative by reproducing it, instead, drawing on the work of my colleagues, I will try to shed a light on the question, what might have actually caused the deportation? Apart from Russian colonialism, of course. It seems that the most obvious reason for deportation was a preparation for a war with Turkey in the Black Sea region, prior to which Stalin was looking to clean the territory of the bordering regions from Muslim Turkic-speaking population, which according to Soviet doctrine couldn't be loyal to the enemy. Not only were Crimean Tatars deported from the border areas for this purpose, but also Meskhetian Turks, Karachay, Balkars, Chechens, and Ingush. The Soviet deportation of Crimean Tatar people in 1944 completed the detatarization of the Crimean Peninsula, which began during the imperial times. The analysis of the state policies that accompanied deportation leads us to the conclusion that those policies were genocidal in its nature. Some researchers also use the terms ethnic cleansing, ethnocide, and even Soviet apartheid. As of today, the deportation of the Crimean Tatars had been recognized as a genocide by the parliaments of Latvia, Lithuania, Canada, Poland, Estonia, and the Czech Republic. The forced eviction of the entire people from Crimea led to the destruction of their way of life, social structure, and of course, culture. Deportation wasn't an event, but a process stretching time, the purpose of which was to destroy the people as a whole community. Exiled to remote areas of Central Asia, Crimean Tatars were expected to assimilate and invent a new homeland for themselves. In addition to physical displacement, Soviet authorities deprived Crimean Tatars of their name. Crimean Tatar nationality ceased to exist in the Soviet censuses, since Soviet authorities categorized them simply as Tatars. This kind of policy, by the way, is common for settler colonies. The deportation of the Crimean Tatar people in 1944 involved not only the forced removal of individuals from their native land, but also the large-scale confiscation of their property, farms, livestock, and personal belongings. The amount of property seized during the operation was enormous and included not only real estate and agricultural assets, but also works of art and objects of cultural heritage. The removal of the indigenous people of Crimea brought another wave of Slavic settlers from the other Soviet republics. For decades after the Second World War, Soviet authorities organized the mass settlement of Crimea with collective farm workers. These settlers were often housed in the homes confiscated from Crimean Tatars. In just 1 year following the deportation of Crimean Tatars, approximately 50,000 kolkhoz workers were resettled in Crimea. The settlement of Crimea with newcomers was systematically carried out over nearly 20 years. Moreover, the deportation of Crimean Tatars made possible the transformation of Crimea into all-union health resort. Crimean Tatar streets, blocks, and villages were ruined to build sanatoriums and other facilities for Soviet workers. After the deportation, the Crimean Autonomous Socialist Soviet Republic, which was created by Lenin as Crimean Tatar national autonomy, it was deprived of its autonomous status and became a regular region, a regular oblast. After 1944, the doctrine of new Russian Crimea was implemented. The Soviet state made an attempt to remove signs of historical presence of Crimean Tatars from the surface of Crimea. Crimean Tatars mosques, graveyards were destroyed, as well as historic Turkic geographical names were replaced with Soviet place names. Soviet authorities made a special effort to remove Crimean Tatars from historical museums and more broadly from the historical narrative about Crimea. Meanwhile, they promoted a Russia-oriented version of Crimea's past. In 1952, a joint academic session of the Soviet Academy of Science was held in Simferopol to rewrite the history of Crimea in a line with the Stalinist ideology and the new status of Crimea, Crimea without Crimean Tatars. The session said that earlier historians made a mistake. They separated Crimea's history from Russia's history and overstated the role of Byzantines, Khazars, Genaeans, Tatars, and Turks. Authors who described Russia's annexation of Crimea in the 18th century as colonial conquest were criticized by this new approach to writing Crimean history. The session instructed Soviet historians how to correct their errors by emphasizing the ancient presence of Slavs in Crimea, portraying the Crimean Tatar period, the Crimean Khanate period, as reactionary and framing Russia's annexation as progressive event. Moreover, the new Crimean narrative portrayed all non-Slavic peoples as occupiers and framed the deportation as an act of liberation for the local Slavic population. This narrative dominated Soviet historiography for nearly 50 years and later influenced modern Russian propaganda used to justify the 2014 occupation of Crimea. Cleansing of the history and creation of a settler colonial historical narrative is one of the most important elements of colonization that enables creation of a settler colonial society. In Crimea, just like in other settler colonies, the Soviet Empire created a completely new image of the space, an all-Soviet resort, a historically Russian land, but not a homeland of indigenous people. This new narrative was supported by corresponding historical monuments, cultural objects, and of course, the dominance of Slavic population. The effective result of the 200 years of the Russian and Soviet settler colonization of Crimea was a complete replacement of the population of the land and of the knowledge about this land, perception of it. Russia effectively replaced the history of Crimea with the history of Russia in Crimea. The peninsula became colonized not only by means of elimination and displacement of its indigenous population, but the very meaning of the word Crimean became completely different. The deportation of 1944 was the culmination of the Soviet national policy and more broadly, the imperial oppression of indigenous people. Because as a result of the deportation, Crimean Tatars were not allowed to live on their own land. In 1956, after the death of Stalin, special settlements regime was cancelled and Crimean Tatars were allowed to leave their places of exile, but not for Crimea. Those who tried to return, they were deported again. During the meetings with party officials, Crimean Tatars were told that Crimea was overpopulated and there was no housing for them. The period after 1956 was, in fact, the time of emergence and rise of the Crimean Tatar national movement, the main goal of which was the return of the Crimean Tatars to the Crimea and the restoration of the Crimean Republic as a nation of autonomy of the Crimean Tatars. Crimean Tatars national movement was a unique and a very powerful phenomenon. It had a horizontal structure, there were no leaders, and everyone from small children but to the elderly took part in the movement. The Crimean Tatars national movement was characterized by strong grassroots organization and community solidarity. Since Crimean Tatars were dispersed in exile, often far from political centers, they relied on local level activism and deep communal bonds to sustain their struggle. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Crimean Tatars national movement was its commitment to nonviolent methods of protest. Despite the harsh treatment they received from the Soviet authorities and the trauma of the deportation, Crimean Tatar activists consistently choose peaceful means to advocate for their rights. These included petitions. Crimean Tatars submitted numerous petitions to Soviet authorities, including hundreds of thousands of signatures demanding their right to return to Crimea. Protests, they organized peaceful protests and demonstrations both in exile and in Moscow to raise awareness about their rights. Hunger strikes, Mustafa Jamilov and others used hunger strikes to draw international attention to the human rights violations against Crimean Tatars. And of course, circulation of information through international media. Crimean Tatars activists secretly organized underground meetings and created networks to spread information. They were gathering money to send their representatives to Moscow, where they visited different state and party authorities, demanding the return of Crimean Tatars to the homeland. For instance, in July of 1967, during a meeting with the Crimean Tatars, KGB chief Yuri Andropov convinced the people's representatives that the issue of their return to the Crimea will be solved very soon. To some extent, Andropov didn't cheat the Crimean Tatars because on September 5, 1967, just a few months, a decree titled About Citizens of Tatar Nationality previously living in Crimea was issued. At first glance, it seemed to cancel all previous decisions regarding the Crimean Tatars, which could be interpreted as you are free to go home now. However, the decree also stated that Crimean Tatars were now deeply rooted in Uzbekistan and even enjoyed the same rights as other Soviet citizens. Together with really strange wording in the decree's title, referring to them as citizens of Tatar nationality previously living in Crimea, it was a clear signal that Crimean Tatars were not welcome to return. Moreover, as it later became clear, another resolution was issued on the same day. It declared that citizens of Tatar nationality previously living in Crimea had the right to live anywhere in the Soviet Union, but only in accordance with existing employment and passports regulations. In reality, it was the second resolution that effectively banned Crimean Tatars from returning to their homeland. Once again, how did it work in practice? From this moment, the return of Crimean Tatars was controlled by passport and registration system. This meant that newcomers needed to register for a residence permit, but in order to register, they first had to have a job. However, without registration, they couldn't legally apply for employment in Crimea. This vicious circle was deliberately created to prevent Crimean Tatars from returning to their homeland. However, the Crimean Tatars became aware of these obstacles only later. The 1967 decree was probably a response to the growing Crimean Tatar protest movement. By that time, Crimean Tatars had begun reaching out to the international community, sharing information about their exile. They adopted the language of international human rights and anti-colonial struggle, skillfully recalibrating Lenin's principle of self-determination of nations. The decree was an attempt by the Soviet authorities to create the illusion that the so-called Crimean Tatar problem no longer existed in the USSR, thereby stripping the movement's activists of their arguments and preventing international organizations and journalists from criticizing Soviet policies. Although the decree issued on September 5 of 1967 was a fraud, it was a trick and a trap. Despite it, many Crimean Tatar families decided they couldn't longer wait for official permission to return. It was this decree that ultimately triggered a process of reverse migration. Thousands of families set out into uncertainty, with elders who dreamed of dying in their native land, and children who had never seen Crimea but had inherited the dream of it from their parents. From September to the end of 1967, around 6,000 Crimean Tatars arrived in Crimea. The first Crimean Tatars who returned made their way to Simferopol, the administrative center of the Crimean Oblast, where all the main state and party authorities were located. They were actively asserting their right to live in their homeland. They demanded registration, employment, and housing, relying on their decree, relying on Lenin's national policy and Soviet war. In the photo, you can see Crimean Tatars standing on the steps of a regional executive committee. Parks and city squares of Simferopol were literally occupied by Crimean Tatars for two main reasons. First of all, they were waiting for appointment with local authorities to get some clarifications about the registration and employment. Secondly, Crimean Tatars were not allowed even to get a hotel room. So streets of the Simferopol were their temporary home. It's difficult to imagine that nearly a year before Soviet tanks entered Prague and before the first documented public protest in the Soviet Union took place on a Red Square, a small group of Crimean Tatars in Simferopol dared to challenge the established Soviet order. In 1967, they encroached upon sacrosanct urban spaces controlled by the authorities, shaped to their specification and designed to reinforce Soviet ideology. For Crimean Tatars, public spaces in Simferopol represented more than just physical locations. They symbolized their homeland and embodied the struggle for recognition and justice. By occupying these spaces, Crimean Tatars asserted their presence in a land that they had been denied for decades, using these urban landscapes as a platform for visibility and resistance. By occupying public spaces, the Crimean Tatars challenged dominant narratives and power structures in the city of Simferopol. This strategy of return, which I term through the front door, represented a form of direct action that lasted approximately for a year. And during this period of time, around 100 Crimean Tatars received a permit, allowing them to relocate back to the peninsula legally. For others, however, it soon became clear that they were not welcome in Crimea. What did Crimean Tatars do when it became obvious that the decree was issued to fool them and that they were not allowed to live in Crimea? They went to small villages in the northern steppe region of Crimea, where they had a better chance of receiving a permit from the local authorities by bribing them, or at least to remain unnoticed to local police officer. In response to this strategy, local authorities started forced evictions from Crimea. These forced evictions looked almost identical to those of 1944. At night, police would break into the homes of Crimean Tatars, throw them onto trucks and take them to railway stations where they were loaded onto trains and deported beyond the borders of Crimea. Such forced removals served as a form of re-traumatization, reminding of the 1944 and received the name repeated deportation. Indeed, this practice of return didn't guarantee success. However, some Crimean Tatars did manage to buy a house, obtain resident permit, and even find employment. Between 1967 and 1978, about 10,000 Crimean Tatars obtained residence permit and returned to their homeland in this way, through the back door. Why did I say in 1978? Growing number of Crimean Tatars coming back to the Crimean Peninsula provoked a strong reaction from the Soviet authorities, both in Crimea and in Moscow. In 1978, forced eviction of Crimean Tatars from Crimea were legalized by Presidium of Supreme Soviet of the USSR. It may sound weird, by the Soviets were trying to make everything according to the law. In 1978, a new resolution made the return of Crimean Tatars virtually impossible. The resolution prohibited the sale of houses to Crimean Tatars, and sanctions were imposed on homeowners who tried to sell house to Crimean Tatars. Moreover, while previously some Crimean Tatars, after being forcibly evicted, they had an opportunity to return quietly to their homes they had bought, and after 1978, such houses were often just demolished by bulldozers. This act effectively halted the return process for nearly a decade. The worsening situation in Crimea led to political persecution and triggered several tragic suicides among Crimean Tatars, including the self-immolation of Musa Mahmud. Crimean Tatar return to Crimea resumed with the start of a so-called perestroika in the USSR. In the summer of 1987, thousands of Crimean Tatars gathered in Moscow's Red Square to peacefully protest the exile and demand the right to return to Crimea. Initially, Soviet authorities were unresponsive and attempted to suppress the movement. And once again, as in 1967, Crimean Tatars decided to return to Crimea despite the ban. In the autumn of 1987, thousands of Crimean Tatars set out for Crimea. At the time, the authorities did everything they could to prevent them from entering the peninsula. Roads were blocked by the police, buses were stopped, and people walked the final stretch on foot in order to reach their homeland. Mass repatriation of the Crimean Tatars in the late 80s and early 90s, it wasn't picture perfect. Local Soviet elites were resisting the return of Crimean Tatars. It created, or in fact continued, a state of exception in which Crimean Tatars were not allowed to choose their place of residence even within their native land. Attempts to restrict the areas of repatriation, as well the number of people to be repatriated to particular areas, had their political and economic impact. By the very end of the Soviet Union, Crimean Tatars were barely allowed to live in rural areas, but only in the northern part of the peninsula, far from seashores, where the land was particularly expensive and away from strategically important cities. This meant that they had to remain invisible, removed from the surface of Crimea, from economic, political, and cultural spheres. At the same time, the limited amount of land that was available for distribution often appeared in the hands of the Russian-speaking population of Crimea. When the privatization of land, homes, and economic enterprises began in the 90s, returning Crimean Tatars had nothing to privatize, as strangers were living in their homes. Upon arriving back in their native land, Crimean Tatars found themselves in the position of being a colonized indigenous people in a settler colony, having returned to an area now dominated by Russian culture and a Russian-speaking population. Despite the obstacles created by the authorities, Crimean Tatars continued to return to Crimea from exile in large numbers. In 1989, the central authorities in Moscow officially recognized that all previous decisions and resolutions regarding the Crimean Tatars had been mistakes. This opened the path toward the restoration of Crimea as a national autonomy for the Crimean Tatar people. However, the local Communist Party elite in Crimea wasn't ready for such a change after nearly half a century. They had grown accustomed to their privileged position on the peninsula. Seizing the initiative, they organized a referendum in January of 1991, proposing the transformation of the Crimean Oblast into autonomous republic, but not a national republic. The Crimean Tatars boycotted the referendum as it ignored their demands. The response of the Crimean Tatar national movement to the referendum was the conveying of the second Kurultai of the Crimean Tatar people held in Simferopol in June of 1991. At this assembly, the Crimean Tatars proclaimed their right to self-determination in Crimea, and the second Kurultai adopted several foundational documents, including the Declaration on the National Sovereignty of the Crimean Tatar people, and elected the Majlis, the representative body of the Crimean Tatar people. Mustafa Djemilov was elected as the head of the Majlis and with Rifat Shubarov as his deputy. The Declaration on the National Sovereignty outlined several key principles, among them the right of Crimean Tatars to self-determination, and the historical significance of the second Kurultai is enormous. Beyond its symbolic meaning, it represents the continuity of national institutions and the ongoing tradition of Crimean Tatar state building. It's time to finish my lecture, but instead of concluding, I want to remind you that repressions against the Crimean Tatars are happening again, this time in a Russian-occupied Crimea. For Crimean Tatars, 2014 marks an emerged strong fear of eviction from Crimea and repeated deportation. It resulted in reassessing and actualizing the old narrative about the homeland as the main and only value that cannot be lost. Probably the biggest fear among the Crimean Tatar population in Crimea, which arose in the spring of 2014 and kept them in tension for a long time, was the fear that the deportation would repeat. Even now, after 11 years, the fear of repeated eviction in any form is still present in Crimean Tatars narratives. Deportation frames overlap with today's events. The morning searches have refreshed a deportation memory pattern. Armed soldiers knocked on the door early in the morning, gave people 15 minutes to prepare, and kicked them out. The 1944 deportation led to the forced and long-term exile. Therefore, the narratives of the Crimean Tatars are saturated with the idea of a native land. Moreover, the memory of deportation and trauma of deportation served as a factor of political mobilization before Russian occupation of Crimea. In 2014, authorities had banned any commemoration and public rally on the main squares of Crimean cities on May 18. After the dominant Russian-centric narrative was included in the state memory politics, the Crimean Tatar memory of the deportation has become marginalized and oppositional. The new repressions and bans on commemoration have pushed the memory back from rallies on the Crimean cities' central squares back inside the families, as it was in the years of exile. The ban on holding rallies on May 18 is not the only form of discrimination Crimean Tatars face on the peninsula. As I mentioned earlier, house searches and arrests of Crimean Tatars often take place early in the morning in Crimea. The reasons for these actions vary: possession of banned literature, support for the Ukrainian armed forces, and of course, denying Russia's right to annex Crimea. Moreover, the Russian occupation authorities have banned the Majlis, the representative body of the Crimean Tatars. In effect, all political activity of the indigenous people has been prohibited. Their cultural expression has been severely restricted. Probably you heard about the so-called hybrid or hidden or quiet deportation. It is a term used to explain the policy of Russian Federation towards the Crimean Tatars in occupied Crimea. It entails really big, like 15 or 20 years prison terms for Crimean Tatars activists and politicians in jails outside of Crimea. Also pushing out of Crimea most active one. Since 2014, more than 20,000 Crimean Tatars left Crimea. And of course, forced mobilization of Crimean Tatars into Russian army after the start of the full-scale invasion. The result of the hybrid deportation is the forced and semi-forced migration of Crimean Tatars from Crimea. In effect, just as in the 19th century, Russia is once again pushing the indigenous people out of their homeland. Since 2013, Crimea has witnessed several waves of migration. The first to leave were activists who feared for their lives, as Crimean Tatars were disappearing in Crimea. And after 2022, when Russia imposed forced conscription in Crimea, many men fled the peninsula to avoid being drafted. Moreover, over the past 11 years, according to various sources, around 1 million Russian settlers have moved to Crimea. This poses a serious challenge for the future reintegration of Crimea after the occupation. This situation creates also new risks for the Crimean Tatar community on the peninsula. Still recovering from years of exile, they are once again facing marginalization and even ghettoization. For example, there are only a few schools in all of Crimea where teaching is conducted in the Crimean Tatar language. This is despite the fact that in 2014, the local occupation authorities declared that the Crimean Tatar language is one of the Crimea's 3 official languages alongside with Russian and Ukrainian. Do you remember I mentioned Catherine's manifesto saying that Crimean Tatars would be granted the same rights as other subjects of the empire. This is an example of post-truth, empty declarations with no real support. And alongside constant threats and discriminations, this is the reality the Crimean Tatars face in today's Crimea. Those who remain in Crimea no longer feel at home. The harsh restrictions against the indigenous population, the restoration of imperial and Soviet symbols, and the introduction of a new, distantly Russian nationalist narrative in a school history curricula, all signals the flourishing of a neo-colonialism in Crimea. The Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014 reminds us about the same colonial practices as imperial and Soviet one. Today in Crimea, Crimean Tatars are others again. This time they're extremists, terrorists, radical Islamists, and even Ukrainian nationalists. The Crimean Tatars, as the indigenous people of the peninsula, serve as a constant reminder to Russians that they are strangers in Crimea. The desire to get rid of this unwanted population, this time in a more human way than in 1944, combined with a large-scale resettlement of people from the Russian Federation, is a continuation of the same settler colonial policy. Crimean Tatars who continue to live in Crimea stands as an example of resistance. By simply remaining on their land, these people resist the occupying authorities who once again seek to cleanse the peninsula of Crimean Tatars. Despite the use of various methods of hybrid deportation, the Crimean Tatars remain in Crimea, refusing to let it become a historically Russian land. Thank you.